Are men in our culture really in crisis? Is that a little bit melodramatic? What would that crisis even mean or look like? And what in the world could potentially be done about it if we even agree that there is a crisis? Well, these are all pretty big questions and ideas that Richard Reeves tackles in his new book of Boys and Men. Let me tell you what I thought. Welcome to Books and Big Ideas, what I'm reading, what I'm thinking about, with Joel Wentz. Okay, I just finished the new book of Boys and Men by Richard Reeves, published by Brookings, and I'm going to take you through my typical format of the main idea of the book, the research behind it, the readability of it, and then my reaction to it. Okay, so the main idea of Boys and Men is a really full-throated kind of call to awareness and action about a crisis around men. In our culture, broadly speaking, particularly American Western culture. That's where Richard Reeves kind of has his sights set. And so the book tries to accomplish multiple things, and the first thing it tries to accomplish is convincing the reader that there is indeed a crisis specifically around men as a subset of the population. And so to make that argument, he essentially, each section of the book kind of breaks apart into three subgroups, which he carries his argument through. So he talks about the crisis in education or learning, the crisis in the workforce or labor, and then the crisis in the family. And so as he sets forward his notion that there is in fact a crisis, he breaks it into those three sub areas of discussion and marshals a lot of data to reify his point that there's a crisis no matter which way you look at it. If you can control just for looking at men are in crisis when it comes to education, rates of education, high school graduation, pursuing higher education, success in terms of graduation and grades and performance and tests and all of that. Men are in crisis, he argues. Men are also in crisis when it comes to the labor force and the workforce, in terms of moving into careers, in terms of holding jobs, in terms of succeeding in jobs, in terms of kind of economic earnings even, which is really interesting. He argues men are in crisis there. And then finally, he argues that men are in crisis when it comes to family life, family structure, in terms of not just things like marriage rates, but in terms of like commitment to the family, commitment to child rearing, and things like commitment to marriage and all of that is also obviously wrapped up in that. But just in general, the like kind of the absence or the lack of cooperation and input in the family is specifically acute, he argues, when it comes to men. And so he argues that there is a crisis in all those areas as it relates specifically to the demographic kind of subset of men. There's another layer in which he does then argue that in particular black men are of a specific crisis, in a specific crisis demographically, but most of the book is not specifically directed at any racial subgroup. Most of the book is directed at men, all told, in our culture. So that's kind of the first big swing he takes, is to argue that there is in fact a crisis that merits our attention. And then he does talk about the intersection of biology and culture. He gets into a little bit of some of his opinions, or some of, not just his opinions, but his interpretations of the research as to why a crisis exists. He comments a good bit on the successes of feminism, and then he talks about that the potential shadow side of that is the lack of attention and kind of care we've given to creating space for men in culture. I'll talk a little bit more about that in my reaction. That's all wrapped up in his argument. He comments on, this book does a lot in a relatively short amount of pages. He comments on our political culture, and in his view, to tip my hand a little bit, one of the strongest parts of the book, I thought, was his view of why both progressive and conservative, left and right, are completely missing the point and woefully not addressing the real issues that are at play in this crisis of masculinity or manhood in our culture. And then finally, he does put forward very, very concrete policy, structural, not so much cultural, a little bit of that. He's hoping that maybe downstream of some policy changes, cultural changes will happen. But he does put forward very, very like practical, real ideas for what might be done to address the crisis that is at hand. That's what the book does. It goes through all of those areas, and even a little bit more that I didn't get to. So that's the main idea of Boys and Men. Okay, the research behind this is very impressive. In particular, so he's done a lot of reading. In particular, he's done a lot of reading of data. So there's a good bit of just hard numerical data, sociological data, demographic data. He pulls on a good bit of research on these different crises, and he doesn't just kind of assert that the crisis is there. He explains it and then points to really like hard to argue with numbers when it comes to, like I said, things like graduation rates. He even gets into some morbid data about deaths of despair and addictions, rates of addiction, rates of things like homelessness, crime, and time spent in jails or prisons or in the kind of justice system. I mean, data that relates to every kind of subset of area that I just talked about in terms of work, education, and family. There's a lot of data. I mean, he does not, in my opinion, doesn't leave a stone unturned. I suspect partly because he knows he's touching a really he's like touching a lightning rod here. And so he did I would say a meticulous job in using research to back up his claims. It's really fascinating. It's really, it's kind of disturbing to look at the numbers, to be honest. It's in my opinion, very hard to read all the data he's marshaled and collected and interpreted. It's very hard to read that data and simply say that there's nothing to pay attention to here. I think the burden of proof is going to be on the person wanting to make that argument. The burden of proof is firmly on them to make that case, because I don't see how you can make a very compelling case that we should not pay attention to all this data and the idea that this data might be pointing to a deep kind of concerning issue. So research is extremely good. One of the strongest parts of the book in general, in my opinion. The readability of it is also quite high. Books like this, I find, they have a hard balance to strike when they're trying to marshal a lot of data, like I just talked about, and also make it continuously compelling and readable. And books like this that tend to be a little bit more focused on the broader systemic issues at play, but also want to use anecdotes to keep the reader engaged. That's a tough balance to strike, and I feel like he struck it quite well. Almost every chapter does start with a personal anecdote. He has sons. He talks a lot about his own journey raising his sons, his concerns for his sons. He uses stories of friends that are very memorable to kind of introduce the theme of each chapter, and then most of the chapter is devoted to data and analyzing and interpreting. He's also quite conversant in a lot of other social issues, like the advent of different waves of feminism and the impacts of feminism, and so he's very conversant in all that, and I would say all this to say he does I think a good job at keeping it readable. It's also pretty short. This book could have been quite a bit longer considering the big ideas that are at play, and I believe it's under 100 or under 200 pages, which is pretty impressive. So overall, pretty readable, especially for the kind of category book it's in. Okay, finally, my reaction to this book. I was interested in this book for multiple reasons. I've been kind of personally just reading up on anthropological, sociological questions around masculinity, manhood, the cultural constructions of manhood versus the biological kind of things that are at play. I've just been interested in that personally for some time, and this book came on my radar because of that, and because it's also getting it's sparking a little bit of discussion, kind of in the broader media. So I was interested in it personally. I also went into it, I went into it and a little bit primed to agree with him, at least in the broad strokes of there is something going on that we must pay attention to here, that I think we should pay attention to here. On an anecdotal level, some of my experience doing a lot of work in college campuses for about 12 years, I just anecdotally saw pretty significant discrepancy between the populations of women and men in the campuses that I had worked with. And that was originally the seedbed of some of my concern about what might be going on here, and so he put some more words to that. So that's a little bit personally where I'm coming from in this book. But I just have to say, I already said in the research section that his data is convincing. His use of data is extremely, extremely convincing, extremely unsettling. But I also want to comment on a few other kind of very specific aspects of this book that I thought were very impressive. So first, I already said he's very conversant in lots of kind of cultural currents. I think he does a remarkable job reiterating over and over again that he is not trying to play the false binary, false choice that is at play in so much of our political discourse. By which I mean, he over and over says, the results of feminism have broadly been good. Women have been freed from restricting economic structures and family structures and home structures that were just way too restrictive for them, particularly the era like the 50s, the suburban housewife era, a lot of feminism can be rightfully said to have been working to free women from those way too narrow life paths in terms of how to be a woman, meaning you had to be a housewife and all that and be economically dependent on a man or a partnership with a man. A lot of feminism has rightfully liberated women from that assumption, and he goes to great pains. Sometimes I was almost like, okay, you don't need to keep repeating this. I think we get that you don't want to be accused of this, but I also understand that's a lightning rod subject. But he really, really carefully is trying to say, those are good gains. Feminism has made good gains. We should keep working to achieve like parity and liberation from unjust kind of limitations upon women in our culture. And that does not mean, like what he's arguing does not mean we then just throw feminism away and just disregard it and don't continue the good work that's been done there. He's trying to urgently say we need to like pay attention to men too. It's pay attention to what's going on with men as well as preserve the gains that have been made for women. So he's trying really, really hard to not play into that dichotomy that's at play in our culture in the discourse around this. And I think he's trying to preemptively respond to lots of critiques he will get. And so, but I think he did an extraordinarily good job at that, if maybe occasionally a little bit repetitive and a little bit too defensive a few times. But I also get why he had to. I mean, if I was writing on this topic, I would probably be very mindful of all the same dynamics. So that's one thing. He talked very, very well, I think, about the gains that have been made for women, and I think he does a really good job threading that needle. Another thing I loved, I particularly loved the section on the left and right political divide, and I thought he was right on in the ways that the left and the right, the progressive and conservatives, are really missing the main point when they respond to these issues. And I found that extremely refreshing. I thought that section of the book was so helpful, and if you are also frustrated with the political divide in so many ways, you will probably really resonate with those chapters. If you are kind of completely in lockstep with a particular political narrative around masculinity and femininity, you're going to be really frustrated by that. But I would urge you to read this book specifically because I think that he is more correct than either political narrative is on this issue. And I love that he included those. I thought that was a kind of a brave thing for him to do. I also loved his inclusion of honest discussions of biology. I know that's another extraordinarily touchy subject right now, sensitive subject, but he talks, I think, pretty honestly about how it's important to reckon with things like hormones, things like just like biological impact of testosterone in populations of men. And I think he does a good job striking a balance there, but also trying to include it and not trying to pretend like that's not at play here. So he talks about nature and nurture, I think very wisely. It's probably too short. That's an extremely complicated discussion, but I think it was wise to include it here. So these are all things that I loved about this book. I really loved all of that stuff. My personal reaction to this was to say, wow, I think that there might be a crisis here, and I think that it's wise to pay attention to the numbers that he brings up, and I think it's also wise to consider, here's kind of the last thing I want to say about this book. He brings up this notion that we've poured a ton of energy into freeing up women from that overly restrictive, culturally conditioned path that was given to them and assumed for them so many decades ago. But we have not, maybe culturally, broadly speaking, we have not paid attention to the other side of that coin, which is what are the implications then for men. And this is the last thing I want to say because this hit me kind of in a personal place because of this. I'm at a stage of life with young kids in that season of my family. And I think he is really right to say we did a lot of work culturally to say that women don't only need to be housebound and family-bound and child-bound. They can also have careers and be in the workforce and be economic participants in their culture that way. Maybe the converse is true, that we need to say to men, you don't only need to be in the workforce, you also can be a family participant. And to destigmatize that in terms of men, to also maybe take down some of the competitive, hyper-competitive machismo kind of related rhetoric around career success. Maybe we can tamper that a little bit and also create space for men to find purpose and joy in the family participation, partnership in the family, balance out all those things that we've worked so hard rightfully to help free women up for. We also need to maybe do some work to give men some room for partnership in other areas of cultural and family life. And I just thought that was so refreshing and so helpful. And I haven't even commented on his very specific policy proposals. I think those are really interesting. I tend to personally get more engaged by the philosophical and cultural discussions, so that's why I've spent more time talking about this. But if you are a policy wonk, if you're really into that stuff, those last chapters are going to be really interesting for you. I thought they were quite intriguing, and I'd be interested to see if people try to put those things into practice in the local level in certain places in our culture. So there you go. Kind of a long discussion, but there's just a lot of potential lightning rods that are related to this book. But those are my thoughts on Of Boys and Men by Richard Reeves. Really wonderful, wonderful book. Very extremely timely, meticulously well-researched, backed up, competently argued, and very persuasive in the broad strokes of what he's trying to say. So there's my thoughts on Of Boys and Men by Richard Reeves. As always, thank you for taking some time to watch.